All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Alex Feldman. I'm a partner at the Asia Group. I've had the privilege of helping the Asia Group stand up our Singapore office, and at the same time, help us focus on the region around Singapore, ASEAN, or Southeast Asia, an area and region that I've long championed. And I'm so privileged to have the opportunity at the Asia Group to help continue to advocate for the long-term strategic value of this important region. The Asia Group, as we often say, is an era where demands need a clear answer to the critical question of what is your ASEAN strategy. For any global company, there is no longer an option, but it is essential to your core business to have an ASEAN strategy. The Asia Group is a leading geopolitical business advisory firm headquartered in Washington, D.C., with offices across the Indo-Pacific. We help our clients navigate the complexity of geopolitical relations as it relates to strategic business objectives. And that's why today's conversation is so timely. We're honored to partner with the Lee Kuan Yew School here at NUS and appreciate the support from important dialogue partners, the American Chamber of Commerce and the US-ASEAN Business Council. I'm especially pleased to be joined by three distinguished colleagues: Dr. Kurt Campbell, our chairman and a key architect of U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy across 4 presidential administrations, and Mr. Matt Pottinger, a longtime friend of the firm and one of the foremost experts on Asia policy in the United States, and last served as President Trump's Deputy National Security Advisor in the first term. And we're also pleased to be joined by NTU Dean Joseph Liow. I also want to express my deep appreciation for Ambassador Chan Heng-chi, who is a steadfast advocate for U.S.-Singapore relations, having served 16 years in the United States as Singapore's ambassador, as well as been a friend ever since, and in many, many roles, including ambassador at large today. I think that the Asia Group, we've seen a surge of interest from multinational CEOs and business leaders seeking to understand and respond to today's geopolitical dynamics. Too often, these discussions focus solely on risk, but we believe that change, especially in geopolitics, also creates extraordinary opportunities for business and statecraft alike. With that, I'm delighted to turn over to Ambassador Chan and our distinguished panel.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very rare privilege for us to have Kurt Campbell and Matt Pottinger in Singapore at the same time and speaking at the same event. You know their titles and you know their achievements. That's why we have a full audience here. And in fact, we were oversubscribed and the press is here. Full court press is here. So I will not go into that. We have Joseph Liow as well, Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at NTU, who will provide a regional sort of input voice in this discussion. Let me explain the format. We'll do about 40 minutes of my questions to them and discussion, and the rest of the next 40 minutes will be handed to you, the audience. Then is a hard stop, they have to go. All right? So let me begin. Now, the world has become more uncertain and more dangerous. In fact, I don't think there's been a more dangerous time than now. In the last 3.5 years, we have seen 4 wars: Ukraine war, Gaza war expanded, India-Pakistan war, and now the Israel-Iran war. And the United States over the weekend joined in by bombing the nuclear facilities. But there is also deep change, great disruption going on in the United States. And great disruption from the United States brought upon the international trading system with the tariff wars. All this since President Trump was inaugurated. Not all the wars, but they preceded him. Tell us, Kurt, Matt, where's the United States going? And has America changed forever? Kurt, would you like to begin?
First of all, let me just say what an honor it is for us to be here today at the Lee Kuan Yew School. I had the good privilege and honor of working for decades with Ambassador Heng Chi when she served with such distinction in the capacity of Singapore's ambassador to the United States. It's great to be with Joe. His new piece is to be highly recommended in Foreign Affairs. He'll talk about that in a bit. I also just want to say it is not an accident that Matt and I are here in Singapore and Japan, like somehow our flights just overlapped. We planned this. We are friends, colleagues. I deeply admire him. We believed it was important for us, two members of different parties who also believe fundamentally in American purpose and commitment to the Indo-Pacific, to come and try to help Asian colleagues and friends, both in government and business and elsewhere, understand what's happening in the United States and design strategies to effectively engage in effective diplomacy towards the United States during a period. And I share with Ambassador Heng Chi said about the risks and the challenges in the global system right now. So I'm honored to be here with Matt. We are trying to model what we think has been effective in the history of American foreign policy. And that is when there is a degree of, excuse me for saying this, but elite consensus around where the United States should be focused and engaged, we have the greatest potential to be effective. And so we both believed in the importance of allies and partners. We both believe that the fundamental shift from other regions more towards the Indo-Pacific is central to American purpose. And we also think that the American role has been indispensable. And so we're here to advocate along those lines. Everywhere I go, I get asked a couple of different questions. What is the quote strategy of the Trump administration? And secondly, has the United States changed and shifted fundamentally to an unrecognizable place? And I want to say, in one kind of way to think about this, is that those are impossible questions to answer, but at the same time you have to have a belief. And so for me, in truth, the United States has gone through extraordinary, difficult, and challenging periods in which we've withdrawn or had a very different vision of our role in global politics. After the First World War in the 1930s, we've had periods of tremendous domestic turmoil in the first decade of the Cold War. And I think ultimately I find myself very much associated with the belief of someone like President Obama, that ultimately, despite our challenges, that the trajectory, the arc of history for the United States will bend in a positive direction, even though we will face enormous domestic challenges. And in fact, for me, I spend a huge amount of my time right now to be encouraged by reading our history. And the history of the United States is one of enormous difficulty and struggle in so many different ways. And yet we have gotten through those periods. And my hope is that we will be able to do the same during a challenging period. I will also say that it is important to also be able to identify areas where we should be reassured. And I hope we will talk a little bit about that today. And I do want to just say how much I've enjoyed over the last couple of days, all the conversations that I've been able to do with Matt.
Ambassador Chan, thanks again for having us. And it's great to be here with Kurt. And we've had some very good meetings today in Singapore where we're listening as much as speaking. And I'm learning a lot of very good things. And I want to second what Kurt was said back at him, that when I came into the Trump administration in 2017 and worked for President Trump for 4 years, in many ways, I felt like I was picking up a baton that Kurt had handed off in terms of emphasizing America's future in the Indo-Pacific region. And Singapore is right at the heart of the Indo-Pacific region. So it's fitting that we're here today. I think it's worth taking a step back to remember that the U.S. in many ways is reacting to an earlier consensus that the world arrived at, and that U.S. People on both sides of the political aisle arrived at, which was to bring China into the global trading system with high hopes. I shared those hopes when I was working in China at the time that the WTO was being negotiated. I was working for Reuters news agency and then the Wall Street Journal in Beijing. I think we all had very high hopes that by bringing China into the WTO, giving China privileged access to the world's '1 economy, the United States, and other economies, that this would help further liberalize China's economy, maybe someday also liberalize its politics to make its political system a bit more humane, if nothing else. And like many things in life, we just happened to be wrong. That consensus was, it's a heartbreak, but it was proved wrong. And much of what you're seeing right now in the U.S., this very painful sort of set of transitions in policy are in reaction to the failure of a 30-year grand strategy to try to make China a cooperative partner through making the Chinese state rich. Many Chinese people have pulled themselves up. In fact, I would argue that China would be even richer today, but for the Chinese Communist Party. But the Chinese Communist Party also became richer in ways that made it more truculent, combative. You mentioned, Ambassador Chan, 3 wars. Well, 4. I would say that the war that we just witnessed, hopefully it will remain confined to 12 days, was if we're lucky, the coda for a while on a war that began on the 7th of October, 2023, when Iran, backing its proxies in multiple places, from backing Hamas, which they trained and equipped in Gaza, to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and the Houthis and so on. That was the opening shot in the war that Iran took. And hopefully what we just witnessed was the coda. Don't hold your breath. It's the Middle East. A ceasefire in the Middle East is sort of like people, pausing to catch their breath. But what I would say is that the U.S. is next year 250 years old. That's more than 4 times Singapore's age this year. It's 60. It's more than 3 times the People's Republic of China's birthday, which is I think they'll be 76. Is that right this year? 76. And the United States has a capacity to adapt and reinvent itself, sometimes extremely painfully, but it is the most adaptive system of government. And I share Kurt's optimism that we are, going to get through a midlife crisis. We're exploring some really bad ideas on both edges of the political spectrum. You're seeing a resurgence of far left socialism in the United States, as exemplified by the mayoral race in New York City overnight. And you see far right nationalism and isolationism. We've been here before. It wasn't pretty in the 1930s either, but we got through it. And I think a lot of Americans will explore this sort of isolationist idea in this funny hope to just be a normal country and not having to carry the burdens of being a great power. But we are a great power, and we're going to have to carry those burdens, just like you saw the president choose to do over the weekend in Iran.
Thank you. Joe.
Okay, very quickly, thanks for the responses. And I very much agree that, number one, the United States does have a very deep reservoir of both resolve and capacity, and that should not be underestimated. Number two, I also believe that eventually you will find an equilibrium, a new equilibrium. But the question is, from our perspective, what happens between now and then? And what's the cost of that process, not just for the United States, but for us and your role in the region, your relationships with us? Because the world has to move on while you find yourself, right? And as the world moves on, it's going to be a situation where, number one, it may look a bit different from what you are familiar with, just as we are asking now whether the United States is different from what we have been familiar with. And number two, the terms of your relationships with friends, allies, partners may also change, may also have changed by then. Yeah. And that is the consequence of the disruption that is going on now, so to speak, that, gets us thinking about what's in store.
So I'll just say one thing if I can, Ambassador, is that I do think every country is adapting a strategy to the challenges that we are facing. And almost every country is adopting a comprehensive, multi-factored strategy. And you see every country realizing that they're going to have to spend more in defense. They are establishing new links with countries that they perhaps did not have as much interaction with before. That brings India more into the fold, into the Indo-Pacific. It builds links between key countries in Asia and Europe. I support that. I think that's very valuable. It leads to new and different kinds of formations and alliances. I would argue that one of the reasons two key allies, but countries that have had real problems finding common space, Japan and South Korea, have decided to work more closely together, is because of these larger anxieties. And then also, lastly, some countries are going to try to find a careful way of engaging China. I think there are going to be some that say, oh, you're going to see a whole-scale move to China. I do not believe that. I believe most countries are going to adopt this kind of comprehensive strategy, but the key focus will be on these early steps, and it will only be part of a larger strategy, a desire to at least engage China more directly. For many of these approaches, I believe those are consistent with a continuing relationship with the United States. I think it will give all these countries greater confidence, a greater sense of their own agency, greater capacity, and I think ultimately can be stabilizing. What we have to be careful about are activities in any of these areas that go beyond what I think would be stabilizing. So, for instance, one of the greatest achievements of American foreign policy in the 1960s, it looked like dozens of nations, particularly in Asia, would decide to go in a nuclear direction. And despite those anxieties, very few countries have taken those steps. And in fact, American extended deterrence is a central pillar of the maintenance of peace and stability. And that, I believe, has to be continued. If a country decided to reconsider their nuclear options, it will not be just one country. It will lead to cascading effects and events, which is very much not in American strategic interests. So I think some of the things that we are likely to see can, Joe, be stabilizing and productive and lead to countries playing a larger, more confident role on the global stage. I'm just going to conclude with one thing. I give Matt enormous credit for this. When I first started working in Asia, now I hate to say it, but coming up on 40 years ago, Japan was often very careful, did not play very much a role in global politics, would be reactive, but not initiative of taking positions on global policy issues. When Matt was Deputy National Security Advisor, he worked closely with the president. He encouraged Japan under Prime Minister Abe to play a larger, more dynamic role. They have greater confidence and a great ability to take initiative on the global stage. That has been stabilizing and positive. And so I don't think everything that we are likely to see will be degrading of security. I think a greater set of, commitments, determination is in our best interest. And I will just say, the message that Matt and I are both bringing to Singapore, there is a tendency in circumstances of upheaval and uncertainty that key Southeast Asian friends think, well, I'm going to just hunker down and I'm just going to wait. That's not the right approach now. It makes sense for a country like Singapore that punches so far above its weight to engage, to make arguments about what's necessary in the United States and China, Japan, and India. And that's what we're here to encourage.
Kurt, you are right in saying that countries in the region are sensing their agency and they are making new friends, new alliances, coalitions, and so on. And that is true. And it's happening because of the reading of the United States, that the United States may, in the end, become the offshore balancer. So we've got to do more for ourselves. But I think what's on their mind right now is this too. Every time the United States says, we want to refocus on Asia, we will pivot to Asia, the Middle East distracts you. Here we go again, okay? So what are you going to say to your Asian partners and friends? Because now we see the Israel-Iran war and the Gaza war will have a long tail. Where will your attention be? And you can both answer this.
Yeah, sure. So in the case of this Iran situation, if we take a step back for a moment and remember that this revolutionary regime in Iran, a totalitarian theocracy, came to power on a policy of wanting to destroy both the United States and Israel. The Ayatollah 2 years ago, I'm going to give you a direct quote, in a speech, a policy address 2 years ago, the Ayatollah said, "When we chant death to America, we are not merely chanting a slogan, we are reciting our policy." And so the Iranian regime has attacked the United States repeatedly, decade after decade, and also pursued these weapons, the nuclear weapons. President Trump gave every opportunity, as did President Biden before him, to try to negotiate away this enrichment capacity. And I think President Trump, who is the last president who wants to get the United States into a Middle East quagmire, really felt he had no choice in the end after the Iranians a couple weeks ago announced that not only were they not going to compromise on their enrichment of uranium, which is already enriched far beyond any civilian or conceivable civilian use. They're enriching to within a hair's breadth of weaponization. The United Nations, the IAEA, which is the UN body that is monitoring this, released a report. The report almost didn't get notice in the press because of the tensions between Israel and Iran. But in fact, this was a scathing UN report delineating all the ways that Iran has cheated on, basically every agreement it's made. And Iran's response was, yeah, not only are we cheating, but we're about to build a third secret enrichment facility. So what are you going to do about it? And Israel answered the next night by killing most of the senior scientists who work on the nuclear program, a lot of the Iranian military leadership, and then going after its ballistic missile and nuclear facilities. I think President Trump took a bold and courageous decision to try to hamper, if not destroy, that nuclear program. I don't think that he is going to send troops into Iran. I think that he's going to try to resist in ways that earlier administrations did not at the turn of the century. That said, I feel your pain on this idea that why is it that the United States keeps getting sucked into this? Kurt and I talk about this all the time. We both are frustrated by the way that the Middle East constantly sucks us back in. But let's wait and see. I think President Trump took very limited goals. He's not seeking regime change. He's been very explicit about that. And those aircraft carriers of the U.S. that are in the Persian Gulf are only 6 days sail from Taiwan.
I associate myself with what Matt said, but I will say this, Ambassador, like the cool thing, if you get to be a Chinese diplomat, you get to like say all these cool historical, kind of quotes. You're always crossing rivers, feeling stones. You're killing chickens to scare monkeys. You've got all these great things. If you're an American diplomat, you have very few things to call upon. And so what we do have are movies. And so I often try to use a movie to make a point. So the first two Godfather movies are probably the best two movies, and there's everything there in terms of wisdom about foreign policy. But it's in the third movie, which is really a pretty awful movie and very overacted. But there's a great quote of overacting Al Pacino in the sort of the twilight of his acting career, in which he's talking about trying to leave the mafia. And he said, I keep trying to leave and they keep pulling me back in. And that's a little bit like the Middle East for us. And in truth, there are many reasons, Ambassador, for why sort of finding and if I could say to Matt, it is not simply aircraft carriers or troops, but it is the mind share and the strategy that's necessary for a comprehensive strategy in the Indo-Pacific. When President Biden came to power, he said, look, we know that we've had problems like this before, so he tried to create an office at the White House. We were able to staff it. At one point, we had almost 30 people in my office. Today, there are precisely one person at the NSC that works on the Indo-Pacific. And we tried to deal with those issues. But the truth is the United States is a global power. We did not predict the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That took an enormous amount of time. So, Heng-Chi, Ambassador, it's not just the Middle East. It is pressing issues in places like Europe. But ultimately, I will also say the bureaucratic issues in Washington around the Middle East are remarkable. Some of our most intrepid military, State Department, and defense bureaucrats work on the Middle East, and they are very good at hoarding capabilities and resources, and we're always asking for more in the Indo-Pacific. But I will say this, we will have to find the wit and wisdom to do more here. We have to, because if we do not, we will be not up to the game. And so I will say this, I think, Ambassador has talked a little bit about this idea of isolationism. And I do not believe that is the dominant way to think about an element in the Trump coalition. And it really is a big tent coalition about how to think about the world. What it really comes down to, yes, there is some anxiety about certain kinds of engagements, but what there really is a philosophy about often acting alone. I want to act alone. I want to be unencumbered by working with allies and partners. My view would be that the challenges that we face require the United States to completely reconceptualize how we engage. We can no longer have paternalistic partnerships with countries like Japan or South Korea. We need to embrace these countries as truly equal partners. That means working in technology and military intelligence and shared strategic assessments to grapple with the challenges on the global stage, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, that we will not be able to handle on our own.
Joe, I'm going to ask you to hold, if you don't mind, because we're running out of time. I want to get on to China. I know China is on your mind, Matt and Kurt, because you have mentioned China, at several times already. So my question is this, Matt, in 2024, you published an article with Mike Gallagher, who's chair of the China Committee in the House. And your article was titled, No Substitute for Victory, America's Competition with China Must Be Won, Not Managed. And you said one of the indicators of victory was that the Chinese people will enjoy freedom, Chinese people can go about their lives living the way they like. Are you advocating regime change? And do you believe that China and the United States can coexist? And I would like that question also about coexistence, Kurt, for you to answer. Do you think China and US can coexist? And Joe, I'd like to have your view too, because the region thinks in a different way.
So the article that you referenced in the Foreign Affairs article I did with Mike Gallagher, No Substitute for Victory, was really making an argument about why a so-called détente policy would not be the right policy for the United States in dealing with the People's Republic of China. And that's because Beijing is playing for victory. If you pay close attention to Xi Jinping's own rhetoric, especially when he's what is written in his internal textbooks that have to be read at the National Defense University or in his internal guidance, it is he lays out what a community of common destiny for mankind means. He has said explicitly in his internal documents that it means overturning the Westphalian system, that the idea that you would have nation states that would enjoy equal rights and a balance of power is explicitly, under Xi Jinping thought in the internal publications, explicitly what they're trying to overturn and replace with something more like a hierarchical empire, global, not just regional. So this is an assault on sovereignty. So our view was the U.S. should also play in ways that impose severe costs on a policy that would undermine our very sovereignty. And you can read the piece. We actually explicitly say in the article that we're not advocating for a U.S. policy of regime change. But if the ultimate result of a harder edged U.S. policy, one that imposes costs on Beijing, leads to a more humane government there, that's something we should welcome and not fear. In those wars that you mentioned in your first remarks, Ambassador, the Beijing is playing a role in each of those wars in ways that are destabilizing. Let's remember that just 19 or 20 days before Vladimir Putin launched his full-bore invasion in 2022 of Ukraine, Xi Jinping hosted him in Beijing for the Olympics. They signed a no limits pact. And a year after that invasion began, it wasn't going well for the Russians. Beijing stepped in and provided massive material support, so much so that President Biden and all of our NATO allies declared that Beijing was the, quote, decisive enabler of this war, so much so that NATO judges that this war would have ended a long time ago but for Beijing's material support. And when Xi Jinping visited Vladimir Putin in March of 2023, they were in the Kremlin, and Xi Jinping was bidding farewell, and he was caught on video saying, "Vladimir, there are changes occurring right now that are unseen in a century, and you and I are the ones driving that change." In other words, Beijing is pursuing a policy of fomenting chaos. Beijing also supported Iran diplomatically, through propaganda support, through economic support, strengthened its support after the Hamas terrorist rampage in Israel in 2023. So we can't just hope that we can coexist. We have to earn coexistence by imposing costs on these types of policies that Beijing's inflicting on the world.
Thanks, Ambassador. And I really like the way Matt put that. I would just make 3 points if I can. First, on the Russia-China dimension, something I worked very hard on in the Biden administration, and I found it very frustrating, to be honest. I was one of the people that went and engaged quietly China in advance of the conflict. I explained to them how destabilizing it would be if Russia decided to invade Ukraine. They did not believe us. In fact, they were themselves surprised by the extent of the invasion. They had to get their people out of Ukraine much more rapidly and in kind of a haphazard manner than they had anticipated. But what Matt lays out is exactly right. And they took steps that went at the core of American purpose. And I will say, and I've both been diplomats a long time, I cannot tell you how many times I've sat in meetings, and Hengchi, you've had this as well, where Chinese will lay out clearly that this is a red line, this is a core interest, don't cross this, understand the significance of this or that, right? And that is meant for us to listen carefully, to be attentive, and to basically craft our foreign policy, at least with those concepts in mind. I will say the truth is that the birth of American strategic purpose was in Europe in the 1940s, and our rallying to the challenges there was what led the United States to play a role on the international stage. And that led to NATO and everything. The fact that China has aided in a conflict that is designed to actually shift the borders and territorial integrity in Europe. And they try to, kind of figure this in such a way that, well, these borders were never really set. They've been unstable since the end of the Cold War. That's a convenient excuse, but the truth is what they are doing is going at the core of our strategic fundamental interests in the maintenance of peace and stability in Europe. And frankly, you have to see it as a very serious challenge. And it forces you to evaluate perhaps differently, Ambassador, what China's ultimate goals and ambitions are. And I will tell you, I found that role deeply concerning, and it was hidden from us often and done in a very sophisticated way, financially, component pieces of capabilities. So that's the first thing I'll do quickly. The second, one of the biggest criticisms, I see you watching your watch, I'll be careful. One of the biggest criticisms of the Biden administration is that we did not articulate an end state of where the U.S.-China relationship should end, and that we had a clear end state during the Cold War. And I would just say how wrong that is. And everyone said, well, no. In Kinnon's piece, he talked about the internal contradictions that would lead into the Soviet system. We conveniently think about that in retrospect. That was not the dominant view through most of the Cold War. The dominant view was the Soviet system was superior and stronger, and that we had to catch up, and that we were at huge disadvantages, and no one really could imagine for decades the collapse of the Soviet Union. The leading proponent of cutting a deal with the Soviet Union was Kissinger, who was worried that we were weaker, that our system was unable to compete with the Soviet Union. And so that's one of the arguments I would make, is that we're in an early phase. And so it is ultimately challenging to describe an end state that you have to spend most of your time thinking about the immediate tasks. And so for me, the greatest challenge, I think the United States has tried to create and develop mechanisms and capacities that are designed to deal with inadvertence and miscalculation. And I believe those right now are our biggest concerns. And that means hotlines, certain kinds of capabilities that will allow for communication and ability to manage a crisis. Now, I will tell you that even though some of them have been set up, China does not take these institutions seriously, and they have not, legitimized them in their own system. When we've needed crisis communications, phones ring off the hooks in rooms that are never answered. And I think part of that is, for a period, the Chinese did not want to signal to the United States that this was like a Cold War. They understood that in some respects the United States would not go quietly as a great power, and they preferred to kind of take steps quietly. But the other reasons were, frankly, institutionally, they had doubts about their own system and the military role in certain kinds of circumstances. And they were probably unaware of some of the risks. We had our own experience during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We had no mechanisms really of crisis management between the United States and the Soviet Union. before the Cuban Missile Crisis, but after the leadership on both sides in Moscow and Washington understood the risks and then took the appropriate steps. We are in many respects in a pre-Cuban Missile Crisis. That should not be reassuring to any of us. We'd love to get to a situation where we have more crisis communications without going through that crisis. But I don't think there is sufficient appreciation for the risks that we face, either in cross-strait circumstances in the South China Sea, or frankly, along the lines that Matt described in the relationships in Europe.
Okay, let me very quickly share my thoughts. Very quickly on the Middle East, I would just say one thing. Yes, indeed, it is the gift that keeps on giving for us in the Indo-Pacific. But maybe another view is that stability in the Middle East is of interest, in our interests, whether in Singapore and Southeast Asia, to the extent that the United States can play a role in creating that stability. It's going to be something that is very important and something we need to take very seriously. Just a quick example. Under the Trump 1.0 administration and the Abrahamic Accords that was established, what that seeded was the idea about Indonesia and Israel possibly pursuing normalization. Now, that feels like a long an era ago, right? But the reality at that time was that discussions that we never thought was possible were starting. Yeah, and we also know that in Southeast Asia, so I do quite a bit of research on Islam in Southeast Asia as well, and I know that in Southeast Asia there's a domestic dimension to what's happening in the Middle East as well. I don't just mean a security dimension. I mean we have Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iran, Turkey jockeying for influence among Muslim communities in Southeast Asia. Yeah, so again, the stability there linked back to our region, I think it's quite integral. On China, very quickly, I hear what both of you have been saying. I think from Southeast Asia's perspective, and I try to speak for 600 million people, but I think what we would like to see is, number one, granted that the communications channels can be improved, but they are necessary and it's good to have them there, and hopefully both parties will work to take it more seriously, particularly the Chinese, based on what you've shared, Kurt. Number two, the question of guardrails, precisely because of how risky the situation is. It's becoming even more urgent to really have serious discussions, accepting the differences, but where are the lines and where are the guardrails? And lastly, in that respect, yes, it's a relationship that's locked in competition, but can China and the United States find areas of of cooperation to show the world, that you guys are taking everyone else's concerns into consideration?
I agree with Joseph. And actually, Kurt, as you described with frustration, the absence of communication between the United States and China, it really struck me, as many of us for a long time now, there's an absence of trust between the two sides, and cultures are different. For instance, you said you showed the Chinese, all these satellite photos and so on, and they didn't take you seriously about the Russians gathering force. The Europeans also didn't believe it, But for the Chinese, it's Sunzi, that you gather force not to use it, but to threaten and get the other side to, succumb. You know that, Matt. You're a Chinese scholar. So I think it's really talking past a bit. And I don't know exactly what the plane loads, what they were delivering to the Russia. And I understand a lot of dual use things, and you have a problem there, but this is an ally. It's been an ally for a long time. So you've got to work that out. But overall, my understanding is that, yes, there's frustration with China over Ukraine, but they try as much as possible to limit their assistance to Russia because they don't want to get further US sanctions, and they've been a bit restrained because of that. You may disagree, but I want to get on to the next question, which is to ask you, before I give the floor over to the audience, about decoupling. If I listen to the President Biden, and now under President Trump and Scott Bessent, the United States does not want decoupling. But I think with these sanctions, with the export controls, the desire to deny Chinese companies access to American capital seems to move towards decoupling. And I see that happening. And let me also say the Chinese are also decoupling. They are taking actions to decouple. And they did that, frankly, when they said made in China 2025, and they would be 70% independent. They want to be 70% independent in critical technologies, I think that was also moving towards decoupling. So do you think that the two economies will be decoupled?
So yeah, I do think that those policies like Made in China 2025, which goes back a decade, right? It goes to the late Obama administration. Those are decoupling strategies that Beijing has been driving. I still fundamentally believe that U.S. strategy under Trump's first term, the Biden administration, and to now Trump again, is fundamentally a reactive strategy. It's a counter strategy to one that Beijing has explained in in Xi's speeches and in his 13th five-year plan, one of making China wholly independent of any reliance on the United States or Western economies for high technology, and to, in a jujitsu move, to make the world's economies wholly dependent on China for high technology. I accompanied President Trump to Beijing in late 2017, and after we had finished our meetings with Xi Jinping, Xi asked the now late Premier Li Keqiang to have one final meeting with President Trump before the president departed for Vietnam. And I can sum up that the message from the Chinese side as the following. It was really this blunt. It was, it is inevitable that we, China, are going to dominate all the technologies of the 21st century, and will rely on America for soybeans and corn. So, and when the United States is not cooperating with us, we'll buy Brazilian soybeans and corn. So you better behave yourself. That was the essence of the message. It was really that blunt. When you're left with that, when the world's number one economy, the elected president of that economy is confronted with that kind of a message, what choice do we have but to react? And that means weaning ourselves off of our dependence on Beijing, on the Chinese economy for things that are really critical to our prosperity this century. But I agree with you. That doesn't mean wholesale decoupling is not going to work. We've seen how interdependent the two economies remain in many ways. But I do think that to borrow the phrase that I saw Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent borrow from the Biden administration and from the Europeans, he's using the phrase de-risking, and that's fine. That's as a concept, I think.
Ambassador, thank you. I'll just make a couple of quick points if I can. The first is we're going to agree to continue the dialogue on China-Russia. I do want to underscore to you directly that it is much more serious than that. And in fact, great efforts have been taken to design the engagements in ways that it is difficult for U.S. and European firms to target through SWIFT sanctions and the like firms that are involved in this. And we can agree to disagree, but I would just simply say it is more significant. And yes, they are dual use, but they are all being used for military capabilities. You could use these things for other things, but the components for explosives, the chips, all the different design components for UAVs are being used on the battlefield to slaughter Ukrainians. And that's just a fact. We can debate that more. I will also say that we have taken efforts occasionally to reach out to find common ground if we can affect certain kinds of cooperation. Let me give you one clear example. When the Houthis quite effectively started striking shipping through the Gulf and going through the Red Sea, much of the shipping that was being hit was directly affecting China, to be honest, because many of the ships were carrying goods back and forth between Europe and China. So we begin putting together a group of nations in both the UN, but also in other venues to be able to both escort shipping, but also, where necessary, protect that shipping. I will be quite clear. We did reach out to the Chinese and ask them, under whatever capacity they chose, whatever international framework, to participate in this because it was affecting their shipping. No answer for 2 weeks. And then we picked up through other sources that what the Chinese did was try to go to the Houthis and say, look, we're going to tell you, we're going to figure out how to let you know which of the ships are Chinese so that you don't target, but the other ships that you can target, right? Now, I'm sorry, that's not cooperation, right? So, but that was a legitimate effort to try to find something that we believed in the past. We had worked with Chinese friends in Djibouti about piracy in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And this, we thought, was in the same vein, and they took steps that were antithetical to our interests. The last thing I would just simply say, Ambassador, is that what we've learned are a couple of different things. First, there are no two economies that are more countries that are more interdependent than the United States and China. And that has been built up as a strategy over decades, right? And it's the entry in the WTO, all the different things. But it is also the case that no two countries are more uncomfortable with that interdependence than the United States and China. And both countries, both leaderships are taking steps to try to ease that interdependence. But it turns out to be much more difficult than either country realized. And the steps that we've tried to take to create redundancy, alternative lines of supply, turns out to be much harder than anyone thought, and it's going to take a lot longer a period of time. And so reluctantly, and with great ambivalence, both countries are realizing how hard it is to decouple. And there's lots of debates who's more vulnerable. We're both vulnerable in very different but corresponding ways. And so that's one of the reasons that are going to force us to have certain kinds of interactions at the same time that both countries are going to be taking steps to try over time to diversify, to reduce reliance. I also want to just say one last thing. I hear what you say about trust. But I do believe, and I'm with Matt on this, that is a misreading of the history of the U.S.-China relationship. I do believe from the very beginning of our relationship that at the core of how China sees the United States is the deepest possible distrust. Even when the decision was to establish relations, that was at the core of how the Chinese saw us. For the architects of the opening, I can assure you that is not how the United States saw China. With great hope, tremendous romance, mysticism almost about the great hope of the opening with China. So the big question is not about this enormous distrust that exists in the United States. The biggest and most interesting question is why the Kissingerian, the logic of engagement with China lasted so long when it was quite clear, really a decade before there was real policy steps, and I give Matt credit for this, having some courage to confront it, when it was quite clear that China had defected from the consensus of a shared future, and they were taking steps that were not win-win, but win-lose, with us being on the secondary side.
Alfred first.
You started out, since we are in Southeast Asia, to highlight that it's important that the region takes more agency. That sounds good on paper. The problem with that is we're moving toward a fragmented world. You basically have two giants that can live happily ever after, but this part of the world cannot. And in this process, without a global governance framework, countries will have to choose. We're seeing it in the financial sector. We're starting to see it on currencies. We're going to see it on the trade side. There is a motivation to look for bilateral trade agreements, which are completely inefficient at the end of the day. So agency sounds good if you don't need scale. This world would suffer enormously if we're going to continue along those lines, because at the end of the day, when you have a payment system, you can either adopt them that is more US-based or a more China-based system, but you cannot have more. You cannot have both. So in a certain kind of way, how does the US react to effectively contributing to this fragmentation that, maybe with the exception of the US and China, everybody ultimately is going to suffer?
My question is, over the past 3 years, we've really seen events and developments in international politics that felt previously unimaginable, from Russia's invasion of Ukraine to, India-Pakistan conflict to the United States bombing Iran. And so to me, it seems like the norms that upheld the international system before the past couple of years have been completely and totally obliterated. And so my question for you is, are we entering a more scary might makes right world where international conflict is just another thing that happens more and more often? And what do you think that means for a small country like Singapore?
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. And I would like to first of all thank all the panelists for the insightful discussion. So my question is, the reciprocal tariff that President Trump imposed recently is an explicit sign that the USA has withdrawn itself from the global leadership and as a force that upholds free trade. And the move by President Trump has left a vacuum that China might fill in. So my question is, how can the USA win back the trust of their allies in the short term and the long term? Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll start with the last one first. Look, for the free trade consensus has really fallen apart within the United States because the promise that was made of what bringing China into the WTO would unleash, what it would unlock, it was billed as things that would be almost entirely positive for the United States. And that's not how it worked out. There were some benefits. There were a lot of downsides in terms of deindustrialization of the United States, in terms of drug use, particularly in those areas where manufacturing jobs disappeared. That's where we saw the fentanyl and synthetic opioid crisis really take root. We saw enormous hemorrhaging of American intellectual property to China, not voluntarily surrendered in a lot of cases to China. So yeah, it's natural that there would be a pretty dramatic rethink right now in the United States of this free trade consensus. Now, I would advocate that the United States should be leveraging its market to find a new consensus with rule of law countries like Singapore, like most of America's treaty allies, and other countries in between as well that are willing to work within a new framework that allows for fairer trade. And so I would have approached it differently, I think, than it's been approached in recent months. But I think things will ultimately shake out in a better place with a lot of costs with the related to this approach the president's taken. But do you want to pick up one of the other questions?
Yeah, thank you. And great questions, guys. And again, it's wonderful for us to have the opportunity to be here. So look, I've had to learn, frankly, the hard way on global trade. So Matt and I will probably have to share a cell someday because we're both very supportive of TPP and we believe in trade. I believe in trade. But when you ask the questions about regaining the trust of allies and partners, probably the first step, and this is along the lines of what Matt just said, many Asian friends, when they come visit the United States, they visit the coast. They don't go to parts of the country that had been completely ravaged by global trade and by bad decisions of American companies. I don't want to go through all the reasons why, but the fact is that we have lost the confidence of large swaths of the United States on issues associated with global trade. We just have, because our strategies have not been effective at retraining and the like. We haven't dealt effectively with the losers, even though there are dominant winners. And, ultimately you can show why trade is ultimately a good thing. There are losers, and our system has not attended to that effectively over the last 30 years in ways that other countries who've had major trade-related adjustments have, like Germany, other countries, Singapore, and other countries in Europe. And so we're going to have to recraft that consensus. I believe that there are going to be areas that we can work together on. We've spent a lot of time here talking about digital areas of cooperation among Indo-Pacific nations in the United States. My hope is that we will be able to take those steps. We got very close in IPEF, very close, and I'd like to try that again. And I know Matt and I are both sort of conspiring about how to interject that into our political thing. And I do believe that some of this work is going to be essential. The only point I would make to the question about has the world been fundamentally upended, I think it's too short-term a view. If you look at the course, the sweep, even in the last 20 or 30 years, we had Rwanda, we had the invasion of Iraq, we had actually much more serious conflicts between India and Pakistan in the past. We had the bombing of Osirak, which was the Menachem Begin strategy of not allowing any country to have a capacity that can affect Israel. So I'm not sure this period is fundamentally more dangerous than in the past. I think the biggest challenge is along the lines of where some of the questions lie, is what will be the relationship between the United States and China, and whether we can find that area of coexistence, which I believe is essential. I do not believe we can wish away China. And I think ultimately we're going to have to find ways to coexist. For me, the essential feature in that strategy is not finding areas to cooperate on. I'd like to be able to do that. I have found that to be very difficult. The most important ingredient is demonstrating that the United States is not in decline. And I know that sounds crazy, but a huge abiding belief in China is the United States is on a cascading kind of, full-on decline. If we can convince China and ourselves that we have the ability to reinvent and to move forward in a positive way. Remember, the belief in American decline has been the overriding conception in Asia for 50 years. It happened during the Korean War, in the Vietnam War, at the end of the Cold War. Each time the United States had the capacity to reinvent itself, to charge forward. The hope is we'll be able to do that again on the back of things like technology. At the core, though, of what it needs to be effective in the United States is elite consensus, so that plans that are started in one administration can be continued on. With all that being said, I think the biggest risk is that the United States has always been the upholder of the system in which might does not make right. And what troubles me there are many things, but I don't like the idea that somehow that Ukraine is the problem or that Taiwan might be the problem, and that we are siding with authoritarian countries and accepting a spheres of influence approach and actually practicing it ourselves. And I will tell you, having a lot of Canadian friends, they don't really want to be friends with me right now because we're threatening them every day. And my Trump friend said, you can take a joke. No, it's not a joke. Talking about invading Canada is not a good thing. And it's crazy. And Greenland and Panama, we cannot go down this path. And it will not be easy to restore trust. But at the same time, I also believe deep down, actually, what I have learned more than anything else, Ambassador, is that in many respects, people outside the United States actually believe more in the United States sometimes than Americans do themselves and want to be reassured. I'll just leave you at that.
I was only going to add, Kurt is exactly right. These periods, these cycles of counting out the United States or viewing it as in decline, that's not a good bet to make, because that bet's been lost many, many times over the last 100 years. For a multilateral trade agreement to work, that would entice a U.S. president, whether it's President Trump or a future Democratic president, there are only probably two constraints. One is China cannot be part of that multilateral framing. And second, the United States has to have some flexibility to be able to enforce the agreement bilaterally and not to wait for some cumbersome mechanism to try to adjudicate in ways that can be gamed, much the way that China gamed its WTO membership. But those are only two constraints. If you could find ways to creatively work with those two constraints, we could see a lot more trade between Asia and the United States.
Thank you. Right, there are more questions. I had a question on that in U.S. From president to president keeping agreements, but let's leave that. You know, I think I ended there. I'll start here.
Fundamentally, Singapore has been successful because it's gotten along with its neighbors. This was not inevitable. Tun Mahathir and LKY did not get along. As far as I know, Mahathir was not at LKY's funeral. Of course, we have the comments about JB that LKY had to back off of. So ultimately, China, which based its Shenzhen model on the free trade port of Singapore, seems to be copying China, seems to be giving China more ideas as well in diplomacy, fundamentally getting along with its neighbors. Why should anyone follow the United States? You just mentioned Canada, right? Just very timely comment you made there. Because the United States is not able to get along with its neighbors. Why shouldn't other countries follow China and Singapore rather than the United States, which seems to be unable to get along with anybody?
Okay. Good evening to all panelists. So I'm Jonathan, a lecturer at the local Institute of Higher Learning. My question is, emerging tech like AI and quantum computing are not just economic drivers, but vectors of national power. So what mechanisms could regional actors like ASEAN countries put in place to prevent becoming collateral in a potential tech war? Thank you.
Third question.
I'm asking because the East Asia... I'm Henry Chen. I'm from Cambodia in the Center of Regional Studies. My question is that the U.S. Reciprocal tariff actually is very clear, targeting ASEAN +1. And as Matt has already mentioned, you want to cut off this supply chain with China as a principal players. So this China +1 model actually is what drives a lot of recent economic development in ASEAN. So if this China plus one model is being cut by the United States, is it going to put ASEAN in a very, very serious dilemma what to do next?
The truth is, I do think relations until quite recently with Canada and Mexico were pretty good. And I think we've had, it's been a long time since the Rooseveltian corollary of the Monroe Doctrine. We've had good relations in our hemisphere. And I believe that will be the norm that we will return to. I hear what you're saying about the case study of Singapore getting along with China. But I don't think that's the most effective case study that I would look at with respect to China. I would look more at the relation between China and Japan and China and India. And I think what you see is a very different dynamic, a difficulty in accepting other powerful states in the international system in a manner that is stabilizing. And so I will tell you quite honestly, I think in both countries, both India and in Japan, there has been historically a desire to find areas of common ground. And that has been very difficult for both of them because the terms that China is setting is difficult for both Delhi and Tokyo to accept. So I hear what you're saying, but I would just, the fact that Singapore can get along with China does not surprise me. The fact that India has had difficulty with China, I think, is more the case that I would look at, but I'll let you think about that a little bit more. And again, I like your hat. To the good question about technology, I would simply say this, that I think what we have learned is that the arena of competition that will play out in the period ahead is actually likely not to be on the military side, at least for a period of time. And again, Matt refers to this. It is remarkable how clueless the United States has been until quite recently. What President Xi articulated beginning in 2013, very publicly, in all of his writings, with a clarity that is remarkable, is we are going to invest in 5G, quantum mechanics, AI, synthetic biology, robotics, and we are going to crush the competition, and we're going to be dominant, and we're going to take all the steps necessary. This is not win-win. We are going to crush the opposition. And frankly, we abetted that in many respects. We let our manufacturing and technology company, Intel was a dominant company until quite recently. We took a number of steps and strategies that essentially undermined our own capability in this arena. And so we were a latecomer to this brutal competition. And that's the arena that we have entered in a fundamental way. My own sense is that the only way that the United States is going to be effective is that if we work more closely with allies and partners in technology. And that means joint areas of investment, ability to share, create parameters for greater alignment, and also restricting certain capabilities from going to China, certain kinds of lithography, other kind of stack controls with respect to AI. And I think the honest truth is what I found over the course of the last 4 years when I was at the White House and the State Department, there were a lot of things that countries were not interested in from the United States. But when technology was mentioned, people perked up and wanted to work more closely with us. That is one of our great tools in our toolbox. We need to use it more effectively.
I was only going to add to supplement what Kurt was saying. China had fatal combat with Indian troops in the summer of just 2020. That's one neighbor. Japan decided to double its investment in defense just a few years ago after China launched missiles into Japan's exclusive economic zone. The Philippines has had sailors wounded recently through Chinese bullying in the South China Sea. Vietnam had many of its sailors murdered on atolls in the South China Sea in the 1980s, and China invaded Vietnam in 1979, tens of thousands of casualties on each side. Russia China claims currently on its official maps, they don't like to broadcast this, but if you look at Chinese textbooks, they claim more Russian territory currently controlled by Russia than all the other territory combined that China claims of its neighbors. And if you talk to Russians below the level of Vladimir Putin, they're pretty nervous about this. So I'm not so sure how great of a neighbor China has been. I just want to add that point. And I missed the question on supply chains. Yeah, look, President Trump is going to, I think his team is going to negotiate rates with ASEAN countries. They're going to be a lot lower than what was advertised in his April 2nd reciprocal tariffs. And the countries that lean into those negotiations, I think are going to get there faster than the ones that hang back. I agree with you. It does benefit ASEAN. I think it helps the United States to be doing more trade with ASEAN and not putting foreign direct investment into Chinese manufacturing. So I agree with you.
Yes, absolutely. And I think 10 is a new 0, and we'll be lucky if we get 15 for the rest of the ASEAN country. I'm going to take one question only. We're out of time.
Thanks, Lily. Hi, my name is Rebecca. I cover Southeast Asia for the Washington Post. American analysts have worried for a long time about Chinese dominance over global port infrastructure. The recent sale or pressure that was exerted on CK Hutchinson to relinquish its portfolio of ports, including the 2 ports in the Panama Canal, and which President Trump has claimed credit for. Did you think, whether that was strategic as a move? And can you say whether you think this reflects a level of assertiveness and a format of direct interference that will be incorporated more into American policy in dealing with China? Thanks.
I can perhaps answer part of that. One of the great things about a Washington Post reporter that is globally significant is there are like 72 questions in that one question. But I would say that deal, which you described, which was really negotiated more in Europe, you know more about it than I do probably, was at its heart a commercial deal done by the Lee family. And I think that it proceeded in a manner in which Hong Kong authorities determined that it did not violate some of the principles of the relationship between China and Hong Kong on the security and the like. So I would say the original conception of this by the key actors involved, the regulators in Hong Kong, the key actors, was that it was a commercial deal. And I think you rightly, Rebecca, indicated that when President Trump described it, though, as a major move in the State of the Union, and I think we recognize and believe that the first time that Xi Jinping heard about it was in the State of the Union, suddenly a commercial deal was then elevated to a strategic level, right? And so now I think what has happened is that there are a number of things that are lurking out there. One is the TikTok deal. Matt and I probably could come up with 5 or 6 that now have not just commercial, but strategic significance. And they await some kind of diplomatic engagement between the leaders. And the one thing I would just simply say, the hard thing about U.S.-China relations right now, Ambassador, is that really it's great that Secretary Bessent has these discussions. In my administration, it was Jake Sullivan and Wang Yi. So we did have some useful areas of engagement. But let's remember, we are putting an enormous amount of burden on leader level diplomacy, right? So you sit down for a couple of hours, the potential for misunderstanding or miscalculation in those meetings is enormous. And I will say, in the Biden administration, I think we understood that the need for unbelievable preparation in advance of those meetings was necessary. So everything was choreographed. I know Matt insisted on that as well. It is true that President Trump doesn't really like all that preparation, wants to just get right to it. But the Chinese don't like to go into a meeting, expose their leadership to circumstances that they cannot predict. So my expectation for all of these issues that are really at the heart of the U.S.-China relations, certain things around technology, whether there will be a big Boeing buy, whether there will be a substantial increase in agricultural products being sold again and beef to China as opposed to coming now primarily from Latin America. Many of those can be discussed, and maybe small agreements can be made between the vice premier and Treasury Secretary Bessent. But in the end, they await what will be a potentially momentous meeting between President Xi and President Trump, in which they're going to have to decide the status of TikTok. They're going to have to decide how they, is this the deal over the ports a commercial deal, or does it have strategic significance? And I think the fundamental answer to that question is we don't know.
That was the last word.
I've had many breakfasts and meetings with Ambassador Chan. I've never gotten the last word with her. I know you're going to want to say something, so please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank the panel speakers, Kurt, Matt, and Joe, for really your thoughts and your views presented to this audience very clearly. And to the audience, I thank you for all your questions. You've made this discussion a really lively, informative, and meaningful one for us to understand the United States in the region, the United States and China, though there could be a lot of ripostes there. But thank you for being here. Thank you.